Nausea and vomiting are common during pregnancy, affecting 70 to 85% of women worldwide, but not in all countries. Population groups that eat more plant-based diets tend to have little or no nausea and vomiting in pregnancy, though. For example, on a nationwide basis, the lowest reported rates in the world are in India, at only 35%. Sometimes symptoms are so severe it can become life-threatening, a condition known as hyperemesis gravidarum. Each year, more than 50,000 pregnant women are hospitalized. What can we do other than reducing our intake of saturated fat, for example, cutting the odds fivefold by cutting out one daily cheeseburger? The best available evidence suggests that ginger is a safe and effective treatment. The recommended dose is a gram of powdered ginger a day. That's about half a teaspoon, which is equivalent to about a full teaspoon of grated fresh ginger, or 4 cups of ginger tea. The maximum recommended daily dose is 4 grams, though, so no more than 2 teaspoons of powdered ginger a day. Cannabis was rated as extremely effective, or effective, by 9 out of 10 pregnant women who used it for morning sickness. But cannabis use during pregnancy may be regarded as potentially harmful to the developing fetus. This is not your mother's marijuana. Today's marijuana is 6 to 7 times more potent than in the 1970s, and may cause problems both for the developing fetus and then later for the developing child. The bottom line is that pregnant and breastfeeding cannabis users should be advised to either decrease or, where possible, cease cannabis use entirely. What do they mean by where possible? Under what circumstances would it not be? People don't realize just how bad it can get. This is how one woman described it. Hyperemesis gravidarum can lead to such violent vomiting you can rupture your esophagus, bleed into your eyes, go blind, or comatose. And so there are certain circumstances where cannabis could be a lifesaver for both the mother and the baby, as women sometimes understandably choose to terminate otherwise wanted pregnancies. Research in human nutrition over the last 40 years has led to numerous discoveries and to a comprehensive understanding of the exact mechanisms behind how food nutrients affect our bodies. However, the epidemics of diet-related chronic diseases, obesity, type 2 diabetes, osteoporosis, heart disease, stroke, cancers, dramatically increases worldwide year after year. Why hasn't all this intricate knowledge translated into improvements in public health? Maybe it has to do with our entire philosophy of nutrition called reductionism, where everything is broken down to its constituent parts, where food is reduced to a collection of single compounds with supposed single effects. The reductionist approach has traditionally been, and continues today, as the dominant approach in nutrition research. For example, did you know that mechanistically there's a chemical in ginger root that downregulated 4-ball myristate acetate-induced phosphorylation of ERK1, 2, and J and K MAP kinases? That's actually pretty cool, but not while millions of people continue to die of diet-related diseases. We already know that 3/4 of chronic disease risk, diabetes, heart attacks, stroke, cancer, can be eliminated if everyone who didn't followed 4 simple practices: not smoking, not being obese, half an hour of exercise a day, eating a healthier diet, defined as more fruits and veggies and whole grains and less meat. Think what that could mean in terms of the human cost. Right? We already know enough to save millions of lives, so shouldn't our efforts be spent implementing these changes before another dollar is spent figuring out whether or not some grape skin extract can lower cholesterol in zebrafish? or even Whole Foods, for that matter. Why spend taxpayer dollars clogging the arteries of striped minnows by feeding them a high-cholesterol diet to see if hawthorn leaves and flowers have the potential to help? Even if they did, and even if it worked in people too, wouldn't it be better to just not clog your arteries in the first place? This dramatic drop in risk, this increase in healthy life years through preventive nutrition need not involve superfoods or herbal extracts or fancy nutritional supplements, just healthier eating. When Hippocrates said something like, "Let food be your medicine and medicine be your food," he didn't mean that foods are drugs, but rather that the best way to remain in good health may be to maintain a healthy diet. Whereas the historical attitude of the field of nutrition may be best summed up by the phrase, "Eat whatever you want after you eat what you should." In other words, eat whatever you want as long as you get your vitamins and minerals, a mindset epitomized by breakfast cereals, providing double-digit vitamins and minerals, but the road to health is not paved with Coke plus vitamins and minerals. This reductionistic attitude is good for the food industry, but not actually good for human health. Because if food is just good for a few nutrients, then you can get away selling vitamin-fortified Twinkies. We need to shift from the concept of just getting adequate nutrition to getting optimal nutrition, not just avoiding scurvy, but promoting health and minimizing our risk of developing degenerative diseases. Bringing things down to their molecular components works for drug development, discovering all the vitamins, curing deficiency diseases, but in the field of nutrition, the reductionist approach is beginning to reach its limits. We discovered all the vitamins more than a half-century ago. When's the last time you heard of someone coming down with scurvy, or pellagra, or kwashiorkor, or the classic deficiency syndromes? Whereas, what about the diseases of dietary excess? Heart disease, diabetes, obesity, hypertension. Ever heard of anyone with any of those? Yet we continue to have this deficiency mindset when it comes to nutrition. When someone tries to reduce their consumption of meat, the first question they may get asked is, "Where are you going to get your protein?" rather than, "Wait a second, if you start eating like that, where are you going to get your heart disease from?" The same deficiency mindset led to the emergence of a multi-billion-dollar supplement industry. What about a daily multivitamin just as insurance against nutrient deficiency? Better insurance would be to just eat healthy food. In the landmark Global Burden of Disease study, they compiled the top 20 causes of death and disability. Number 1 on the list was high blood pressure. 2 and 3 are smoke. The number 4 leading cause of loss of life and health was not eating enough fruit. Lack of exercise was number 10, then too much sodium, then not enough nuts and seeds, not enough whole grains, not enough vegetables, and number 18 was not getting enough long-chain omega-3 fatty acids like EPA and DHA found in seafood due to their purported protective effect against heart disease. Even years ago, when this was published, however, they were already questioning the benefits of these fish fats, as more and more randomized controlled trials put them to the test, and they failed, and culminating in the recent meta-analysis that I profiled previously that appeared to put the issue to rest. Cardiovascular protection isn't the only thing fish and fish oil consumption was hyped for, though. Omega-3s have also been touted to treat depression. But after taking into account all the negative results that went unpublished, there appears to be no benefit for major depression or for preventing suicide, as I explored previously in my video on fish consumption and suicide. But what about for the prevention of cognitive decline or dementia? The available randomized controlled trials show no benefit for cognitive function for omega-3 supplementation in studies lasting from 6 months to 40 months among healthy older adults. It may sometimes even make things worse. Higher current fish consumption predicted worse cognitive performance, and greater past fish consumption in childhood predicted slowed perceptual speed and reaction time. This may be due to neurotoxic contaminants in fish, such as mercury. We've known that the developing brain is particularly sensitive to the damaging effects of mercury, but maybe the aging brain is as well. This would explain results like this, where higher omega-3 levels were associated with high levels of cognitive impairment and dementia, more EPA found in the cognitively impaired, and more DHA found in the demented, presumably because of pollutants like mercury and PCBs in seafood that have been related to cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease. The same cognitive functions disrupted in adults, like attention, fine motor function, verbal memory, are similar to those previously reported in children exposed in the womb. And the adults exposed to mercury through fish consumption didn't just have subtle EEG brainwave changes or something, but observable deficits in neurobehavioral performance measures. For example, poorer performance on tests of fine motor speed and dexterity, concentration. Some aspects of verbal learning and memory were also disrupted by mercury exposure, and the greater the mercury levels, the worse they did. But look, this study was done downstream of a gold mining operation, a process that uses lots of mercury. Other such studies were done on people eating fish next to chemical plants, or toxic spills, or eating whale meat. What about a more mainstream population? In fact, an elite group of well-educated participants, really well-educated, most were corporate executives like CEOs, all living in Florida, and wealthy enough to afford so much seafood that at least 43% exceeded the EPA safety limit for mercury, and it had an effect. Excessive seafood intake, which they defined as more than 3 or 4 servings per month of fish like tuna or snapper, elevates mercury levels and causes cognitive dysfunction. Not much, only about a 5% drop in cognitive performance, but a decrement that no one, let alone a health-conscious and achievement-oriented person, is likely to welcome. It's worth noting the irony of this situation, the fact that corporate executives who choose to overconsume seafood for health reasons instead sustained a drop in their executive functions as a result. Yet if a 4.8% drop in executive function due to excessive seafood intake occurs in highly functioning healthy adults with ample cognitive reserve, the major concern is whether similar mercury level elevations in individuals already suffering from cognitive decline might result in substantially greater declines, particularly with cognitive decline, dementia, and seafood consumption on the rise. In 2012, a meta-analysis was published tying white rice consumption to diabetes, especially in Asian countries, as I explored previously. But even in the US, where we eat much less, the regular consumption of white rice was associated with a higher risk of type 2 diabetes, though brown rice was associated with lower risk, and that was after controlling for other lifestyle and dietary factors such as smoking and exercise and meat and fruit and vegetable consumption. They estimated that replacing even just a third of a serving per day of white rice with the same amount of brown rice might lower diabetes risk 16%. Since the meta-analysis was published in 2012, a study out of Spain suggested white rice consumption was associated with decreased diabetes risk, but it was a tiny study compared to the others, hundreds compared to hundreds of thousands of people involved. In Spain, rice is usually consumed in the form of paella, which has a spice saffron, which may have a therapeutic potential against diabetes, and white rice consumers also ate more beans, which appear to have anti-diabetic properties as well. So this gives you a sense of how difficult it is to infer cause and effect relationships from population studies. Since you can't control for everything, yes, you can control for weight, smoking, alcohol, exercise, etc., But maybe people who are smart enough to eat brown rice are also smart enough to wear seatbelts and bike helmets and install smoke detectors and forego bungee jumping. What we need is a way to fund randomized interventional studies, where we switch people from white rice to brown rice and see what happens. Until then, the effects of the consumption of white rice on the development of type 2 diabetes will remain unclear. But we didn't have such studies until now. Overweight women were randomized into two groups, a weight loss group with a cup of cooked white rice every day, or a cup of cooked brown for 6 weeks, and then the groups switched. The white rice group ate brown, and vice versa. And when they were eating brown rice, they got significantly more weight loss, particularly around the waist and hips, lower blood pressure, and less inflammation. Similar effects were found for pre-diabetics. Substituting brown rice for white rice led to significantly more weight loss, more waist loss, and better blood pressures. And brown rice may not just help get rid of tummy fat, but also preserve our artery function. See, high blood sugars can stiffen our arteries, cutting their ability to relax in half within an hour, whether you're diabetic, have prediabetes, or are non-diabetic, though for diabetics, their arteries go down and stay down. And we know that brown rice can have blood sugar lowering effects compared to white rice, so can switching to brown rice help preserve arterial function? In folks with metabolic syndrome, within an hour of eating about a cup of cooked white rice, we can get a drop in artery function, but not so with brown rice. Despite all the benefits of whole grain rice, Asian people often prefer white rice, considering it softer and tastier than brown. But in a focus group of Chinese adults, only a minority had ever even tried it. Before tasting brown rice, the majority of participants considered it to be inferior to white rice in terms of taste and quality, so the researchers just served some up, and after actually tasting it and learning about it, most changed their minds. For many years, it was believed that the main function of the large intestine was to just absorb water and dispose of waste, but nowadays it's clear that the complex microbial ecosystem in our intestines should be considered as a separate organ within the body, and that organ runs on a MAC, microbiota accessible carbohydrates. In other words, primarily fiber. One reason we can get an increase of nearly 2 grams of stool for every 1 gram of fiber is that the fiber fermentation process in our colon promotes bacterial growth. The bulk of our stool by weight is pure bacteria, trillions and trillions of bacteria. And that was on a wimpy, fiber-deficient British diet. People who take fiber supplements know this. A few spoonfuls of fiber can lead to a massive bowel movement, because fiber is what our good gut bacteria thrive on. When we eat a whole plant food like fruit, we're telling our gut flora to be fruitful and multiply. And from fiber, our gut flora produce short-chain fatty acids, which are an important energy source for the cells lining our colon. So we feed our flora with fiber, and then they turn around and feed us right back. These short-chain fatty acids also function to suppress inflammation and cancer. That's why eating fiber may be so good for us. But when we don't eat enough whole plant foods, we are in effect starving our microbial self. On traditional plant-based diets, like Dr. Burkett described, lots of fiber, lots of short-chain fatty acids, lots of protection from Western diseases like colon cancer. Whereas on a standard American diet, where we're eating highly processed food, there's nothing left over for our gut flora. It's all absorbed in the small intestine before it ever makes it down to the colon. Not only may this mean loss of beneficial microbial metabolites, but also a loss in the beneficial microbes themselves. The biggest issue presented by a Western diet is that not leaving anything for our bacteria to eat results in dysbiosis, an imbalance where bad bacteria can take over and increase our susceptibility to inflammatory diseases or colon cancer, or maybe even metabolic syndrome, or type 2 diabetes, or cardiovascular disease. It's like when astronauts return from space flights having lost most of their good bacteria because they had no access to real food. Well, too many of us are leading an astronaut-type lifestyle, not eating fresh fruits and vegetables. For example, the astronauts lost nearly 100% of their Lactobacillus plantarum, which is one of the good guys. But most Americans don't have any to begin with, though those that eat more plant-based are certainly doing better. Use it or lose it. If you feed people resistant starch, a type of fiber found in beans, within days the bacteria that eat resistant starch shoot up, and then die back off when you stop eating it. Eating just a half can of chickpeas every day may modulate the intestinal microbial composition to promote intestinal health, by increasing potentially good bacteria and decreasing pathogenic and putrefactive bacteria. Unfortunately, most Americans don't eat beans every day, or whole grains, or enough fruits and vegetables, so the gut flora, the gut microbiota of a seemingly healthy person may not be the equivalent to a healthy gut flora. It's possible that the Western microbiota is actually dysbiotic in the first place, just because we're eating such fiber-deficient diets compared to populations that may eat 5 times more fiber and end up with like 50 times less colon cancer. Caramel coloring may be the most widely consumed food coloring in the world. Unfortunately, its manufacture can sometimes lead to the formation of a carcinogen called methylimidazole, which was identified as a cancer-causing chemical in 2007. And so for the purposes of their Prop 65 labeling law, California set a daily limit at 29 micrograms a day. So how much cancer might caramel-colored soft drinks be causing? We didn't know until now. 110 soft drink samples were tested off store shelves in California and around New York. None of the carcinogens was found in Sprite, for example, which is what you'd expect since it's not caramel-colored brown. Among sodas that were, the highest levels were found in Goya brand soda, and the lowest in Coke products, about 20 times less than in Pepsi products. Interestingly, California Pepsi was significantly less carcinogenic than New York Pepsi, presumably because of the law in California. This supports the notion that labeling laws like Prop 65 can incentivize manufacturers to reduce foodborne chemical risks, rather than just wish they could all be California. To protect consumers around the rest of the country, federal regulations could be a valuable approach to reducing excess cancer risk. But how much cancer are we talking about? Johns Hopkins researchers calculated the cancer burden, an estimate of the number of lifetime excess cancer cases associated with the consumption of the various beverages. So at the average U.S. soda intake, with the average levels of carcinogens found, Pepsi may be causing thousands of cancer cases, especially non-California Pepsi products, which appear to be causing 20 times more cancer than Coke. Of course, no need for any of them to have any carcinogens at all, but we don't have to wait for government regulation or corporate social responsibility. We can exercise personal responsibility and just stop drinking soda altogether. Cutting out soda may reduce our risk of becoming obese and getting diabetes and fatty liver disease and hip fractures and rheumatoid arthritis and chronic kidney disease and maybe gout as well. In children, daily soda consumption may increase the odds of asthma 5-fold, and increase the risk of premature puberty in girls, raising the likelihood they start getting their periods before age 11 by as much as 47%. If you look at the back of people's eyes, you can measure the caliber of the arteries in their retina, and the narrower they are, the higher the risk of high blood pressure, diabetes, and heart disease. If you do these kinds of measurements on thousands of 12-year-olds and ask them about their soda drinking habits, children who consume soft drinks daily had significantly narrower arteries. So the message to patients can no longer just be, eat less, exercise more. It matters what you eat. Specific dietary advice should be to significantly reduce the consumption of processed food and added sugar, and to eat more whole foods. A cancer diagnosis is seen as a teachable moment in medicine, where we can try to get people to eat healthier. But research suggests that male cancer patients in particular may be reluctant to introduce dietary modification. This has been attributed to dietary changes often being viewed as mimicking feminine eating behaviors, such as emphasizing an increase in fruits and vegetables. Although healthy eating might enhance long-term survival, few men with prostate cancer make dietary changes to advance their well-being. Many of the cancer survival trials, for example, require adherence to strict plant-based diets, and though researchers tried providing extensive nutrition education and counseling programs, dietary adherence was still a challenge. The way Dean Ornish was apparently able to reverse the progression of prostate cancer with a plant-based diet was home-delivering prepared meals to their door, figuring men are so lazy they'll just eat whatever's put in front of them. After all, male culture tends to encourage men to go for convenience food, meat, and beer. Take Men's Health magazine, for example. Included in their list of things men should never apologize for, liking McDonald's, not offering a vegetarian alternative, and laughing at people who eat trail mix. Featured articles with titles like "Vegetables are for girls," and sections like "Men and meat, there's only one kind of flesh we like better, and even then, she'd better know how to grill." To appeal to male sensibilities, doctors are advised to use body-as-machine metaphors, framing men's health in terms of mechanical objects, such as cars requiring tuning. But if men are so concerned about their masculinity and manhood, maybe we should instead share a bit about what prostate cancer treatment entails. The prostate is situated at the base of the penis, and so when you core it out with a radical prostatectomy, you lose about an inch off your penis if it gets erect at all. Only 16% of men undergoing the procedure will regain their pre-surgery level of erectile functioning. Patients are typically quoted erectile dysfunction rates around 60% or 70%, but studies have generally considered erectile function recovery as just the ability to maintain an erection hard enough for penetration about 50% of the time. So getting it up occasionally is considered recovery. But when a surgeon tells a patient he will recover function, the patient probably assumes that means the kind of function they had prior to surgery, and that only happens 16% of the time, and only 4% of the time in men over 60. Only 1 in 25 get their baseline sexual function back. And it's not just erections, but other problems like OAP, orgasm-associated pain, even years later, and urinary incontinence during foreplay, stimulation, or orgasm. The vast majority of couples overestimate how much function they're going to recover. Couples reported feeling loss and grief. Having cancer is bad enough without the additional losses. You'd think that would be enough to motivate men to improve their diets, but almost a fourth of men newly diagnosed with prostate cancer state that they would prefer to have their lives cut short rather than living with a diet that prohibits beef and pork. More men would rather be impotent than improve their diet. It appears pleasures of the flesh may sometimes even trump pleasures of the flesh. Back in 1912, when hardly anyone smoked cigarettes, lung cancer was like a museum curiosity, extremely rare, but in the next few decades rose dramatically around the world, about 15-fold. But they had already nailed it back in 1912. By mid-century, the evidence linking lung cancer and tobacco was considered overwhelming. Says who? Says the tobacco industry's own research scientists in an internal memo. We now know that senior scientists and executives within the cigarette industry knew about the cancer risks of smoking at least as early as the 1940s. But publicly, they said things like, yeah, sure, there are statistics associating lung cancer and cigarettes, but there are statistics associating lung cancer with all sorts of things, but there's no proof. What was the government saying? Smoke luckies. I mean, who wouldn't want to give their throat a vacation, not a single case of throat irritation? How could your throat and nose be adversely affected when cigarettes are just as pure as the water you drink? Maybe in Flint, Michigan. And if you do get irritated, no problem. Your doctor can write you a prescription for cigarettes. This is an ad from the Journal of the American Medical Association. After all, don't smoke is advice hard for patients to swallow. It reminds me of the recent survey of doctors that found the #1 reason doctors don't prescribe heart-healthy diets was their perception that patients fear being deprived of all the junk they're eating. After all, Philip Morris reminded us, we want to keep our patients happy. To make a radical change in habit may do harm. You're a doctor. You don't want to harm your patients. Even bunnies prefer Philip Morris when you install smoke solutions in their eyes. The tobacco industry gave medical journals big bucks to run ads like these. Not a problem, though. Philip Morris claims come from completely reliable sources, based on studies conducted by recognized authorities published in leading medical journals, even kindly offering to send free packs of cigarettes to doctors so they can test them out themselves. So join us at the next AMA convention. What did the American Medical Association have to say for itself? Like most other medical journals, they accepted tobacco ads. We have yet to see an autopsy with a single lesion that had a Marlboro label on it. No lung tumor has ever been found with a little tag attached saying, made in the tobacco fields of North Carolina. Case closed. In fact, even after the Surgeon General report came out, the American Medical Association, American Cancer Society, and Congress still dragged their feet. The government was still subsidizing tobacco like our tax dollars subsidize the sugar and meat industries today. The AMA actually went on record refusing to endorse the Surgeon General's report. Could it have been because they were just handed $10 million from the tobacco industry? Today, the money is coming from big food. The American Academy of Family Physicians has accepted large sums of money from Coca-Cola to fund patient education on obesity prevention. I wonder what that pamphlet's going to say. Who is the #1 partner listed on Coca-Cola's website? The American College of Cardiology. Just as it would have been hazardous to your health to take the medical profession's advice on your smoking habits in the 50s, it may be hazardous to your health today to take the medical profession's advice on your eating habits. Supplement manufacturers often fall into the same reductionist trap as the drug companies. Herbs are assumed to only have one main active ingredient, so if you can isolate it and purify it into a pill, the thinking goes, you can boost the effects. Curcumin is described as the active ingredient in turmeric. But is it the active ingredient, or just a active ingredient? It's just one of many different components of the whole food spice. There's also cyclocurcumin, and curcumins, and turmerine, turmeronal. Only limited studies have compared the potential of turmeric with curcumin, but some suggest turmeric, the whole food, may work even better, and not just against colon cancer cells. This group of researchers at Anderson Cancer Center in Texas pitted curcumin against 7 different types of human cancer cells in vitro, and also turmeric. For example, curcumin kicks butt against breast cancer cells, but turmeric, the whole food, kicks even more butt. Curcumin against pancreatic cancer, turmeric against pancreatic cancer, colon cancer, multiple myeloma, myelogenous leukemia, and more colorectal cancer. They found that turmeric was more potent compared to curcumin, suggesting that components other than curcumin can also contribute to anti-cancer activities. Most clinical studies treating diseases in people have used curcumin supplements as opposed to whole turmeric, but none have tried using turmeric components other than curcumin. But see, even curcumin-free turmeric exhibits anti-inflammatory and anti-cancer activities. Although curcumin is believed to account for most activities of turmeric, research over the past decades has indicated that curcumin-free turmeric, so turmeric with the so-called active ingredient removed, is as effective or even more effective than curcumin-containing turmeric. There are turmerones, for example, in turmeric, but processed out to make curcumin supplements, which may exhibit both anti-cancer as well as anti-inflammatory activities. So I assumed this review would conclude, let's stop giving people curcumin supplements and just give people the whole food spice turmeric. But instead they were like, hey, let's make all sorts of different turmeric-derived supplements. There's been a history of enthusiasm for protein in the nutrition world. A century ago, the protein requirements were more than twice what we know them to be today. This enthusiasm peaked in the 1950s, and with the United Nations identifying protein deficiency as a serious, widespread global problem. There was a protein gap that needed to be filled. This was certainly convenient for the U.S. dairy industry, who could dump their post-war surplus of dried milk onto the Third World, rather than having to just bury it. But this led to the great protein fiasco. There was a disease of malnutrition called kwashiorkor that was assumed to be caused by protein deficiency, famously discovered by Dr. Cicely Williams, who spent the latter half of her life debunking the very condition that she first described. Turns out there's no real evidence of dietary protein deficiency. The actual cause of kwashiorkor remains obscure, but fecal transplant studies suggest changes in gut flora may be a causal factor. How could the field of nutrition have gotten it so spectacularly wrong? A famous editorial about the profession started with these words: "The dispassionate objectivity of scientists is a myth. No scientist is simply involved in the single-minded pursuit of truth. He or she is also engaged in the passionate pursuit of research, grants, and professional success. Nutritionists may wish to attack malnutrition, but they also wish to earn their living in ways they find congenial. This inevitably encourages researchers to make a case for the importance of their own portion of the field and their nutrient, which was protein." Science eventually prevailed, though, and there was a massive recalculation of human protein requirements in the 1970s, which at the stroke of a pen closed the so-called protein gap and destroyed the theory of this pandemic of protein malnutrition. Infant protein requirements went from a recommended 13% of daily calories down to 10%, then 7%, and then down to 5%. However, to this day, there are still those obsessing about protein. Those promoting Paleolithic diets, for example, try to make the case for protein from an evolutionary perspective. OK, so let's ask the question, what is the perfect food for human beings? The food that was fine-tuned just for us over millions of years to have the perfect amount of protein? Human breast milk. If high-quality protein was the nutrient among nutrients, helping us build our big brains over the last few million years, one would expect that importance to be resoundingly reflected in the composition of human breast milk, especially since infancy is the time of our most rapid growth. But this is patently not the case. Human breast milk is one of the lowest protein milks in the mammalian world. In fact, it may have the lowest protein concentration of any animal in the world, less than 1% protein by weight. This is one of the reasons why feeding straight cow's milk to babies can be so dangerous. The protein content in human milk is described as extremely low, but it's not low at all. It's right where it needs to be. That's the natural, normal level for the human species, fine-tuned over millions of years. Adults require no more than 0.8 or 0.9 grams of protein per healthy kilogram of body weight per day. So that's like your ideal weight in pounds multiplied by 4 and then divided by 10. So someone whose ideal weight is 100 pounds may require up to 40 grams of protein a day. On average, they probably only need about 30 grams a day, which is 0.66 grams per kilogram, but we say 0.8 or 0.9 because everyone's different and we want to capture most of the bell curve. People are more likely to suffer from protein excess than protein deficiency. The adverse effects associated with long-term high-protein diets may include disorders of bone and calcium balance, disorders of kidney function, increased cancer risk, disorders of the liver, and worsening of coronary artery disease. Therefore, there's currently no reasonable scientific basis to recommend protein consumption above the current recommended daily allowance due to its potential disease risks. My last in-depth video series on vitamin D was done more than 4 years ago, as in 15,950 papers ago. I had a lot of catching up to do. Review articles like this continue to be published touting vitamin D as a veritable cure-all. The vitamin D receptor is found in most tissues in the body, including the brain. Upwards of 2,000 genes may be regulated by vitamin D. Within 24 hours of vitamin D exposure, you can change the expression of hundreds of genes. The term vitamin, though, is actually a misnomer. Vitamins, by definition, cannot be synthesized within our body, but we can make all the D we need with sufficient sun exposure. D is not a vitamin, but a hormone produced by our skin in response to sunlight exposure. And it's not just a hormone of calcium regulation and bone health, but a hormone of fertility and immunity and brain function. But is it a panacea or a false prophet? Remember when vitamin E was the vitamin du jour, touted as curative for many clinical disorders? Vitamin E, the radical protector, with supplement sales in general forming a billion-dollar business to capitalize on the public's fears. After all, those with low levels of vitamin E in their blood had 50% higher cancer risk. Hey, and what about vitamin A or beta-carotene? After all, people who eat lots of greens and sweet potatoes and other beta-carotene-rich foods have lower risk of cancer, so hey, let's give people some beta-carotene pills. But when they were put to the test, beta-carotene pills increased cancer rates. Beta-carotene, vitamin A, and vitamin E supplements may increase mortality, and in fact we'd be potentially paying to shorten our lifespan. So you can understand the skepticism in the medical community regarding claims about vitamin D, which is now enjoying its moment in the sun. Having a $500 million vitamin D supplement industry doesn't help matters in terms of getting at the truth, not to mention the highly lucrative vitamin D testing industry that loves to talk about the studies suggesting having higher vitamin D levels may reduce the risk of heart disease and cancer and diabetes, autoimmune diseases, and infections. But most of this research stems from observational studies, meaning studies that correlate higher D levels in the blood with lower disease risk. But that doesn't mean vitamin D is the cause, right? It's like the early beta-carotene data, right? Higher levels in the blood may have just been a marker of healthy eating. Who has high beta-carotene levels? Those who eat lots of greens and sweet potatoes. Just like vitamin D levels may also just be a marker for healthy behaviors. Who has high vitamin D levels? Those that run around outside. And those who run around outside run around outside. Higher vitamin D levels may just be a sign of higher physical activity, for example. So when she studies like this, showing significantly lower diabetes rates among those with higher vitamin D levels, it doesn't mean giving people vitamin D will necessarily help. You have to put it to the test. And when you do, vitamin D supplements fall flat on their face. No benefit for preventing or treating type 2 diabetes. So when supplement companies wave around studies like this, suggesting vitamin D deficiency plays a role in obesity, because most population studies show lower vitamin D levels in the blood of those who are obese, is that just because they're exercising less, or simply because it's a fat-soluble vitamin, so it's just lodged in all that fat? One might expect obese sunbathers would make more vitamin D since they have more skin surface area, but the same exposure leads to less than half the D because it gets socked away in their fat. That's why obese persons may require 2 to 3 times the dose of vitamin D, though they may get it back when they lose weight and release it back into their circulation. So that would explain this population data. And indeed, when you put vitamin D to the test, try vitamin D as a treatment for obesity, it doesn't work at all. Similar story with artery health. Those with low vitamin D levels have worse coronary blood flow, more atherosclerosis, and worse artery function. But if you actually put it to the test in randomized controlled trials, the results are disappointing. Also ineffective in bringing down blood pressures. So this all adds to this growing body of science casting doubt on the ability of vitamin D supplementation to improve anything beyond just falls, fractures, the common cold, and all-cause mortality. Wait, what? Vitamin D supplements can make you live longer? That's kind of important. In 1822, a Polish physician was the first to publish that sunlight could cure the vitamin D deficiency disease rickets. His work was ignored by mainstream medicine for a century, not coming into widespread use until the 20th century, when wire cages were affixed to tenement buildings so babies could benefit from the sun. Are we in a similar situation now, where the medical profession is just not caught up with the science? Researchers have documented correlations between all sorts of good things to higher vitamin D levels, even to the point of seeing whether vitamin D supplementation might reduce the adverse effects of earthquakes. Seems to help with everything else, so why not? It's actually not as silly as it sounds. Traumatic events like natural disasters can have a significant psychological impact, which may be affected by vitamin D status. But when researchers put supplements to the test, the purported links often didn't pan out. This lack of effect may exist in part because low vitamin D levels may just be a marker for things like aging, obesity, smoking, and inactivity. Or maybe low vitamin D didn't lead to disease, but maybe disease led to low vitamin D. Inflammation can drop D levels within the body. So just because low D levels and disease seem to be correlated doesn't mean that vitamin D deficiency is the cause. While the majority of observational studies may show a link, where you just measure vitamin D levels and disease rates, in only a handful of conditions have interventional studies proven vitamin D to be effective, where you give people D supplements or placebos and see what happens. But one of those conditions for which vitamin D supplements appear to genuinely work is helping to prevent mortality. 56 randomized clinical trials involving nearly 100,000 people between the ages of 18 and 107, mostly women, randomized to 4 years of vitamin D supplements or sugar pills, put all the studies together, and those given vitamin D supplements lived longer, also specifically lowering the risk of dying from cancer. Note this effect appeared limited to vitamin D3, though, the type derived from plants and animals, not D2, the type derived from yeast and mushrooms. How large an effect was it? It would take 150 people taking vitamin D supplements for 5 years to save 1 life. And so if we were talking about a drug, you'd have to weigh that against the cost and side effects of dosing so many people. But when we're talking about something as safe and cheap as vitamin D supplements, it seems like a bargain to me. A similar analysis pegged the benefit at 11% in terms of reduction of total mortality, which is pretty substantial, potentially offering a life extension benefit on par with exercise. Though, no, it does not seem to reduce the adverse effects of earthquakes. The only concern that was raised is that it may give people license to order an extra donut or something. I mean, we still have to eat healthy, right? Any longevity benefit from vitamin D would just be a small adjunct to a healthy lifestyle. But for those of us who want all the help they can get, the question then becomes, OK, how much should we take? Randomized controlled clinical trials have found that vitamin D supplements extend one's lifespan. What is the optimal dose? What blood levels associated with living longest? In my 9-part video series on vitamin D back in 2011, I noted that the relationship between vitamin D levels and mortality appeared to be a U-shaped curve, meaning low vitamin D levels were associated with increased mortality, but so were levels that were too high, with the apparent sweet spot around 75 or 80 nanomoles per liter, based on individual studies like this one. Why might higher D levels be associated with higher risk? Well, this was a population study, so you can't be sure which came first. Maybe the vitamin D led to higher risk, or maybe higher risk led to the vitamin D, meaning maybe those who weren't doing as well were prescribed vitamin D. Maybe it's because these were Scandinavian studies where they tend to take a lot of cod liver oil as the vitamin D supplement, 1 spoonful of which could exceed the tolerable upper daily limit of intake for vitamin A, which could have negative consequences, even if you don't inject it into your penis. I was surprised to see cod liver oil listed among the long list of things men have tried to inject into themselves because they felt they were coming up short, though may have ended up even shorter after all the reconstructive surgery. Anyways, the U-shaped curve is old data. An updated meta-analysis has shown that as population vitamin D levels go up, mortality appears to go down and stay down, which is good, because then we don't have to test to see if we're hitting just the right level. Routine testing of vitamin D levels is not recommended. Why? Well, it costs money, and in most people, levels come right up to where you want them with sufficient sun or supplementation, so they figure, what's the point? But also because the test is not very good. Results can be all over the place. What happens when you send a single sample to 1,000 different labs around the world? You'd maybe expect a little variation, but not this. Results from the same sample ranged anywhere from less than 20 to over 100. So depending on what lab your doctor sent your blood sample to, the results could have placed you here or here. So not necessarily very helpful. So what's a safe dose that will likely get us to the purported optimal level? 1,000 units a day should get most people up to the target 75 nanomoles per liter, which is 30 nanograms per milliliter. But by most people, they mean 50%. To get around 85% of the population up to 75 would require 2,000 a day. 2,000 international units a day would shift the curve from here to here. That way, we can take the average person into the desired range without fear of toxicity. You can take too much vitamin D, but you don't tend to see problems until blood levels get up around 250, which would take consistent daily doses in excess of 10,000. Note that if you're overweight, you may want to take 3,000, or if obese, even more than that. If you're over age 70 and not getting enough sun, it may take 3,500 units to get that same 85% chance of bumping your levels past the target. Again, no need for the average person to test and retest, since a few thousand a day should bring almost everyone up without risking toxicity. OK, but then why did the Institute of Medicine set the recommended daily allowance at 600 to 800 units? In fact, official recommendations are all over the map, ranging from just 200 a day all the way up to 10,000 a day. If everyone took 2,000 units of vitamin D a day, it could shift the curve from average blood levels in the mid-50s to about 110, which some estimate could add years to our life expectancy. Data derived from randomized clinical trials have convinced some influential experts, such as Harvard's chair of nutrition, that we should shoot for this kind of range, levels that about 9 out of 10 people fail to reach, because it may necessitate taking between 1,800 and 4,000 units a day. The Institute of Medicine, however, considered blood levels of 50 to be sufficient, and therefore only recommended 600 to 800 units a day for those with little or no sun exposure, because they were only considering bone health. But even if you just cared about your bones and not your lifespan, you'd still probably want to shoot for the 75 threshold, because there's evidence like this from hundreds of autopsies of people that died in car accidents showing osteomalacia, softening of the bones, and between 18 and 39% of people that reach the Institute of Medicine target, but fail to make it to 75. There's even been a charge that the Institute of Medicine simply just made a mistake in their calculations, and so using their own criteria, they should be recommending thousands of units a day as well. But the mere absence of soft bones can hardly be considered an adequate definition either of health or of vitamin D sufficiency. It's like saying you only need 10 milligrams of vitamin C to avoid scurvy. Yeah, but we need way more than that for optimal health. The Institute of Medicine took the position that the burden of proof fell on anyone who claimed benefits for intake higher than their minimal recommendations, which is a good approach for drugs. For unnatural substances, less is more until proven otherwise. But for nutrients, shouldn't the starting point, at least, be the natural levels to which our bodies have become finely tuned over millions of years? The target level of 75 only sounds high compared to average levels today. But in modern times, we practice unnatural activities like working at a desk job, or sometimes even wearing clothes. We evolved running around naked in equatorial Africa, getting sun all day long. If you measure vitamin D levels in those living traditional lives in the cradle of humanity, a normal vitamin D level would be over 100. So maybe that should be the starting point until proven otherwise, a concept regrettably many guidelines committees seems to have ignored. Now look, the natural level isn't necessarily the optimal level. Maybe the body would have thrived with less. So you still have to look at what levels correspond to the lowest disease rates, and when you do, the highest levels do indeed seem to correlate with less disease. You know what always struck me when I was doing pediatrics? That breastfed babies required vitamin D drops. I mean, shouldn't human breast milk be a perfect food? Of course, for the medical profession, the solution is simple, right? Provide the baby supplements, the drops. But it seems like we shouldn't have to, right? It should be perfect. But look, you measure human breast milk these days, and it has virtually no vitamin D, and would cause rickets, unless the mom had vitamin D levels up around, you guessed it, the level natural for our species, which of course makes total sense. So it's just like an environmental mismatch, the way we live in our modern world. It helps to think of vitamin D as what it truly is, a hormone, not a vitamin. So if you think of it like that, then it would be reasonable to have normal levels. Right? We physicians try to maintain blood pressure and all sorts of parameters within normal limits, but why is so little attention paid to the status of the hormone vitamin D? If one is going to make an evolutionary argument for what a natural vitamin D level might be, how about getting vitamin D in the way nature intended, sun instead of supplements? Let's run through the pros and cons. Though supplements may only cost about $10 a year, sunlight is free. You never have to worry about getting too much vitamin D from sunlight, since your body has a way to regulate production in the skin, so we don't have to put our trust in poorly regulated supplement companies to not mislabel their products. Only about half the brands came within 10% of their labeled amount. And sunlight may have benefits beyond vitamin D, like the amazing story about how your body may use the sun's near-infrared rays that penetrate your skin to activate chlorophyll byproducts in your bloodstream to make CoQ10. Well, there's another way your body appears to use the sun's rays to maximize the effects of the greens we eat. Within 30 minutes of exposure to the ultraviolet rays in sunlight, you can get a significant drop in blood pressure, an improvement in artery function, thanks to a burst of nitric oxide-releasing compounds that flow into your bloodstream. You can even measure the nitric oxide gas gassing straight off of your skin. Of course, you actually have to eat your greens or beets in the first place for this to happen, but that combo of greens and sunlight may help explain some of the protection that plant-based eaters experience. Morning sun exposure may help those with seasonal affective disorder, as well as improve the mood of wheelchair-bound nursing home residents. I've talked about the benefits of avoiding light at night, but underexposure to daytime sunlight may also affect our melatonin levels, which doesn't just regulate our circadian rhythms, but may also be helpful in the prevention of cancer and other diseases. Older men and women getting 2 hours of outside light during the day appear to secrete 13% more melatonin at night, though we're not sure what, if any, clinical significance this has. The downsides of sun exposure include increased risk of cataracts, a leading cause of vision loss, though this risk can be minimized by wearing a brimmed hat and sunglasses. Sunlight also ages your skin, as illustrated here. Who can guess what profession this guy was in? He was a truck driver who spent his decades getting more sun on the left side of his face, even through a window. You can see what sun can do. The effects of sunlight on the skin are profound, accounting for up to 90% of visible skin aging, wrinkles, thickening, loss of elasticity. Things like sun exposure and smoking can make you look 11 years older. Cosmetic surgery can make you look 8 years younger, but a healthy lifestyle may work even better. The reason doctors preach sun protection, though, is not for youthful facial looks, but because of skin cancer. Medical authorities from the World Health Organization, American Cancer Society, and the Surgeon General warn about excess sun exposure, and for good reason, given the millions of skin cancers and thousands of deaths diagnosed every year in the U.S. alone. The UV rays in sunlight are considered a so-called complete carcinogen, meaning they can not only initiate cancer, but promote its progression and spread. Melanoma is the scariest, which makes the rising incidence among young women particularly alarming. This increase has been blamed on the increased usage of tanning salons. Tanning beds and UV rays in general are considered Class 1 carcinogens, like processed meat, accounting for as many as 3/4 of melanoma cases among young people. 6 times the risk of melanoma for those who visited tanning salons 10 or more times before the age of 30. The tanning industry is big business, bringing in billions. There may be more tanning salons than there are Starbucks, and they use those dollars like the tobacco industry to downplay the risks of their products. Now, laws are being passed to regulate tanning salons, including complete prohibitions, like in the country of Brazil, to age restrictions for minors. But unlike tobacco, right, tanning isn't addictive, or is it? There are people who tan compulsively and report a so-called tanner's high. Describing tanning behavior like a substance abuse disorder seems on face a little silly until you stick people in a brain scanner and can show the same kind of reward pathways light up in the brain, thanks to endorphins released by your skin when you're exposed to UV rays, such that you can even induce withdrawal-like symptoms, giving tanners opiate-blocking drugs. So potentially addictive, but dangerous. Harvard researchers suggesting we should view recreational tanning and heroin abuse as engaging in the same biological pathways. But there's a reason sun exposure feels good. That's a good thing, evolutionarily, because sunlight is the primary natural source of vitamin D. So throughout evolution, right, it's more important in terms of passing along your genes to not die of rickets in childhood. Forget skin cancer in your old age. Unlike natural sunlight, tanning bed lights emit mostly UVA, which is the worst of both worlds, cancer risk with little or no vitamin D production. But the small amount of UVB many do admit may be enough to raise vitamin D levels. If only there was a way to raise vitamin D levels without risking cancer, there is vitamin D supplements. By the turn of the 20th century, the vitamin D deficiency disease rickets was rampant, thanks to city life, with the shade of the buildings and coal soot in the air. The dairy industry jumped at the opportunity to fortify milk with vitamin D, and so did the beer industry. Beer is good for you, read the ad, but beer with sunshine vitamin D is extra good, so drink it every day. Now, there are healthier fortified options, like vitamin D-fortified orange juice, but to reach recommended intake levels, it could take 15 to 20 cups of fortified milk, beer, and/or juice every day. So, to get those kind of doses, it really comes down to sun or supplements. Sunlight supplies 90 to 95% of vitamin D for most people. The threat of skin cancer is real, however, it's mostly from chronic excessive sun exposure and sunburns. There's little evidence that minimal, sensible exposure to sunlight will considerably increase the risk of skin cancer, though why accept any risk at all when you can just get your vitamin D from supplements? But for the sake of argument, what if there were no supplements available? What if you were just trying to balance the positive and negative effects of sun exposure? On one side, you have entities like the American Academy of Dermatology that recommends that no one should be exposed to direct sunlight without sun protection. After all, the UV rays in the sun are proven carcinogens, responsible for about half of all Caucasian malignancies, blaming the tanning industry for downplaying the risk. Even those who accept research dollars from the tanning industry acknowledge that excessive sun exposure can increase skin cancer risk, but argue for moderation, advocating quote-unquote sensible sun exposure, and blame the sunscreen industry for over-inflating the risk. Though it's harder to impugn the motives of the dermatologists, who are essentially arguing against their financial interests, since skin cancer is their bread and butter. The concern raised by UV advocates is that sun-phobic propaganda may do more harm than good, pointing to studies like this. A Swedish study found that those diagnosed with skin cancer tended to live longer and have less heart attacks and hip fractures. The media, of course, loved this, with headlines like "Sunbathers live longer," though only natural UV exposure was associated with reduced mortality. Artificial UV exposure, like tanning beds, was associated with increased mortality. Well, then, this probably has nothing to do with vitamin D, then. Why would those that run around outside enough to get skin cancer live longer? Maybe it's because they're running around outside. More exercise may explain why they live longer. And here in the US, more UV exposure was associated with a shorter, not longer, lifespan. Now, there are modeling studies that suggest that at least 50,000 American cancer deaths may be attributable to low vitamin D levels that could be avoidable with more sunlight exposure, that would only kill at most 12,000 Americans from skin cancer. So on balance, the benefits would outweigh the risks. But again, why accept any risk at all when you can get all the vitamin D you need from supplements? In fact, where did they get those estimates about vitamin D preventing internal cancers? From intervention studies involving giving people vitamin D supplements, not exposing people to UV rays. So it's not much of a controversy at all, after all. The issue is framed as needing to choose between the lesser of two evils, skin cancer versus internal cancers from vitamin D deficiency, but ignores the fact that there's a third way. When we were evolving, we didn't live long enough to have to worry about skin cancer, and vitamin D was not available at the corner store. And if you just want to look more attractive, how about eating more fruits and vegetables? When high kale models were pitted against high UV models, the golden glow from carotenoid phytonutrients won out. And the same has been found in Asian and African American faces. So may I suggest the produce aisle to get a good, healthy tan? Jareen. In the original description of Parkinson's disease by none other than Dr. James Parkinson himself, he described a characteristic feature of the disease, constipation, torpid or lethargic bowels, which may precede the diagnosis by many years. In fact, bowel movement frequency may be predictive. Men with less than daily bowel movements were 4 times more likely to develop Parkinson's an average of 12 years later. Now, this could just be a really early symptom of the disease, tied to decreased water intake. Many Parkinson's patients report never really feeling very thirsty. Maybe that led to the constipation. Or, alternately, the constipation may have increased the risk of Parkinson's disease, as constipation results in a longer stay of the waste in the bowel, and thus more absorption of potential neurotoxins from the diet. Yes, there are 2 studies suggesting an association between constipation and Parkinson's, but at the same time there are 38 studies linking the disease to pesticide exposure, and by now more than 100 studies linking pesticides to an increased risk of up to 80%. Now, many of these studies are on occupational exposure, like farm workers, who may reduce their risk of Parkinson's by wearing gloves and washing their clothes. But Parkinson's has also been linked to ambient exposure. Approximately 1 billion pounds of pesticides are applied annually in the US, and just living or working in high-spray areas may increase Parkinson's risk. And the same with using pesticides in the home. I didn't realize how common household pesticide use was, but this study out of UCLA suggests it might not be such a good idea. Pesticides may cause DNA mutations that increase susceptibility for the disease, or play a more direct role. See, many neurodegenerative diseases appear to be caused by the buildup of misfolded proteins. In Alzheimer's, it's the protein amyloid beta. In Creutzfeldt-Jakob and mad cow disease, it's prions. In Huntington's, it's a different protein. And in Parkinson's disease, it's a protein called alpha-synuclein. And a variety of pesticides, 8 out of the 12 they tested, were able to trigger synuclein accumulation in human nerve cells, at least in a petri dish. The buildup of synuclein may play a role in killing off specialized nerve cells in the brain, 70% of which are gone by the time the first symptoms arise. Pesticides are so good at killing these neurons that pesticides are used to try to recreate Parkinson's disease in lab animals. Is there any way to stop the process? Well, there's no drugs yet that can prevent this protein aggregation. What about flavonoid phytonutrients, natural compounds found in certain fruits and vegetables? They can cross the blood-brain barrier and may have neuroprotective effects. So they tested 48 different plant compounds to see if any could stop the clumping of synuclein proteins into the little fibers that clog up the cell. And they found a variety of flavonoids that can not only inhibit the spiderweb-like formation of synuclein fibers, but some could even break them up. Turns out flavonoids may actually bind to synuclein proteins and stabilize them. Here's some healthy brain cells. The arrows are pointed to the neurites, the arms that nerve cells use to communicate with each other. Here's after exposure to a pesticide, though. The cell is damaged, retracts its little arms. But if you first incubate the nerve cells with a blueberry extract, the nerve cell appears better able to withstand the pesticide effects. So this implies that flavonoids in our diet may be combating Parkinson's disease as we speak, and healthy diets may be effective in preventing and even quote-unquote curing the disorder, but these were all petri dish experiments in a laboratory. Is there any evidence that people eating berries are protected from Parkinson's? There was this study, published forever ago, that suggested the consumption of blueberries and strawberries was protective, but this was a tiny study, and the results were not statistically significant, which is why I never brought up the study before. But that was the best we had until now. Those eating a variety of phytonutrients were less likely to develop Parkinson's disease. Specifically, higher intake of berries was associated with significantly lower risk. The accompanying editorial, An Apple a Day to Prevent Parkinson's Disease, concluded that more research is necessary, but until then, an apple a day might be a good idea. Of course, this is coming from a man. Apples appeared to be protective against Parkinson's for men, but not women. However, everyone appeared to benefit from the berries. We just may not want to have our berries with cream, as the milk supply may be contaminated with the same kind of neurotoxic pesticide residues found in the brains of Parkinson's disease victims. Dr. Walter Kempner introduced the first comprehensive dietary program to treat chronic kidney disease, and in doing so also revolutionized the treatment of other disorders, including obesity. Kempner was a professor emeritus of medicine at Duke, where he came up with the so-called rice diet, which basically consists of rice, sugar, fruit, and fruit juices. Extremely low sodium, low fat, no animal fat, no cholesterol, no animal protein. The sugar was added as a source of calories so people wouldn't lose too much weight, but some people need to lose weight, so he started treating obese patients with a lower-calorie version of the diet. He published this analysis of 106 patients who lost at least 100 pounds. Not because there were only 106, he was just picking the last 100 people who lost over 100 pounds, and by the time he finished looking through their charts, 6 more had joined the so-called Century Club. Average weight loss among them 141 pounds. This study demonstrates that massively obese persons can achieve marked weight reduction, even normalization of weight, without hospitalization, surgery, or pharmacologic intervention. Here's a weight chart of someone who lost in a year nearly 300 pounds, from like 430 pounds down to 130 pounds. One important fact to be gained from this study is that, despite the misconception to the contrary, massive obesity is not an uncorrectable malady. Weight loss can be achieved, massive obesity can be corrected, and it can be done without drastic intervention. Well, the rice diet is pretty drastic. Definitely don't try this at home. The rice diet is dangerous. It's so restricted that it may cause serious electrolyte imbalances unless the patient is carefully medically supervised with frequent blood and urine lab testing. Dangerous? Says who? Said the world's #1 advocate for the rice diet, Dr. Kempner himself. The best safe approximation of the diet, so low in sodium and also no animal fat, protein, and cholesterol, would be a vitamin B12 fortified diet centered around whole, unprocessed plant foods. But even a medically supervised rice diet could be considered undrastic compared to like getting one's internal organs stapled or rearranged, wiring someone's jaws shut, or even brain surgery. Attempts have been made to destroy the parts of the brain associated with a sensation of hunger by irradiation or by going in through the skull and burning them out. It shows how ineffective most simpler forms of treatment are, that anyone should think it reasonable to produce irreversible intracranial brain lesions in very obese patients. The surgeons defended these practices, these procedures, explaining that their justification in attempting the operation is, of course, the very poor results of conventional therapy in gross obesity, and the dark prognosis, mental and physical, of the uncorrected condition. To which a critic replied, such strong feelings about how dark the prognosis is runs the risk of being conveyed to the patient to the effect of masking the operative dangers of experimental surgery and steamrolling the patient's approval, to which the surgeon replied, look, if any steamrolling is taking place, it comes rather from obese patients who sometimes threaten suicide unless they are accepted for experimental surgical treatment. As of 2013, the American Medical Association officially declared obesity a disease, by identifying the enormous humanitarian impact of obesity as requiring the medical care and attention of other diseases. But the way we treat diseases these days involves drugs and surgery. Anti-obesity drugs have been pulled from the market again and again after they started killing people. This unrelenting fall of the pharmacological treatment of obesity. The same thing has happened with obesity surgeries. The procedure Kempner wrote about was discontinued because of the complication of causing irreversible cirrhosis of the liver. Here are the current procedures, including various reconfigurations of the digestive tract. Complications of surgery occur in almost about 20% of patients, nearly 1 in 10 of which may be death. In one of the largest studies, 1.9% of patients died within a month of the surgery. Even if surgery proves sustainably effective, the need to rely on the rearrangement of our anatomy as an alternative to better use of feet and forks, diet and exercise, seems a societal travesty. Phthalates are hormone-disrupting chemicals linked to a number of adverse health effects, such as disturbing infant and child development, and in adults may affect reproductive health in men, endometriosis in women, and is associated with increased abdominal fat in both. Given the increasing evidence base linking phthalate exposure with harmful outcomes, it's important to understand major sources of exposure, the most major of which is diet. For if you take people and have them stop eating for a few days, you get a significant drop in the amount of phthalates spilling out into their urine. One can only fast for so long, though. Thankfully, we can see similar drops just eating a plant-based diet for a few days, which gives us a clue as to where most phthalates are found. The highest levels are found in meats, fats, and dairy. Poultry consistently comes out as being most contaminated across the board, with some of the highest levels ever reported, though there are geographic exceptions. In the UK, fish came out worse, and in Belgium, nothing appears to beat out reindeer meat. In the US, though, it's poultry. The finding that egg consumption is also significantly associated with phthalate levels suggests that chickens themselves may be contaminated, and it's not just like the plastic they're wrapped with in the store. The same might not be true with dairy, though. Realizing that these chemicals may be harmful, researchers in Seattle took 10 families and randomized them into 5 days of complete dietary replacement with fresh organic foods. No packaging, nothing touched plastic. Organic milk delivered in glass. Even the crates to carry the food were wood instead of plastic. This was like the fasting study, to see what role eliminating processed foods would have on lowering phthalate levels, because not everyone wants to switch to a plant-based diet or stop eating completely. Here's where the family started at baseline before changing their diet, and here's where they ended up a week after the experiment when they were back on their baseline diet. The question is, what happened in the middle? Eating fresh and organic, their phthalate levels went up. A dramatic and unexpected increase in one of the most toxic phthalates, and not just a little, like 2,000% increase. So they tested all the foods, and one of the spices was off the chart, and so was the dairy, because most of the phthalates apparently don't come from the cow, they come from the tubing. If you milk a cow by hand, which even the Amish don't do anymore, the level of phthalates in the milk are low. But if you milk the same cows by machine, the milk picks up phthalates from the tubing, and so the final levels may depend more on the tubing than on what the cows are fed. Whereas we're not sure where the chickens are getting it. This study was done on adults more recently. We learned where our kids may be getting it from. They found pretty much the same thing, mostly meat, poultry, and fish. And again, poultry appeared to be the worst, while soy consumption was associated with significantly lower levels. But what kind of exposure are we talking about? They calculated what may be typical exposures for infants, teens, and women. How does this compare with current guidelines? Well, the EPA's reference dose, which is like the maximum acceptable threshold, is 20, based on liver risk. Europe places their maximum daily intake for testicular toxicity at 50. So a typical infant diet exceeds the EPA's safety level, while a diet high in meat and dairy was approximately 4 times this threshold. For adolescents, a diet high in meat and dairy also exceeded the EPA's reference dose. Diets high in meat and dairy consumption resulted in a 2-fold increase in exposure. And all diets from all groups exceeded the allowable daily intakes derived by the U.S. Consumer Product and Safety Commission for problems with sperm production, while diets high in meat and dairy consumption may exceed the allowable intake for risk of reproductive birth defects as well. We are in an epidemic of osteoporosis. 10 million Americans have it, and 1 in 3 older women will get it. We urgently need public health strategies to maintain bone health and prevent osteoporosis. Might fruits and vegetables be the unexpected natural answer to the question of osteoporosis prevention? Evidence from a variety of studies strongly points to a positive link between fruit and vegetable consumption and indexes of bone health, such as bone mineral density. And the size of the effect in the older women is impressive, doubling the fruit intake associated with a 5% higher spine mineralization, and the same relationship with young women too. And eating lots of fruit in childhood may protect bones throughout life, something that was not found for milk intake, as I've explored before. Bone health isn't just about calcium. There are several key nutrients in fruits and vegetables and beans associated with better bone mineral density, but does that translate into lower hip fracture risk? The Singapore Chinese Health Study found that a diet rich in plant-based foods, namely vegetables, fruits, and beans such as soy, indeed may reduce the risk of hip fracture. But why? The underlying mechanism in postmenopausal osteoporosis is an imbalance between bone cessation and bone formation, and oxidative stress may play a role in this balance. There are two types of bone cells: the bone-forming osteoblasts and the bone-dismantling osteoclasts. Osteoblasts are continually laying down new bone, while osteoclasts chisel away old bone, and they use free radicals as the molecular chisel to chip away our bone. Too many free radicals in our system, though, may lead to excessive bone breakdown. Antioxidant defenses appear markedly decreased in osteoporotic women. Elderly osteoporotic women were found to have consistently lower levels of all natural antioxidants tested. Because excessive free radicals may contribute to bone loss, it's important to elucidate the potential role antioxidant-rich fruits play in mitigating the bone loss that leads to the development of osteoporosis. The thought is that fruits upregulate the bone-building cells and downregulate the bone-eating cells, tipping the balance towards greater bone mass. So let's put a fruit to the test. Which one are we going to pick? Well, dried plums were chosen because they have among the highest antioxidant ranking among commonly consumed fruits and vegetables, and because the researchers scored a grant from the California Dried Plum Board. When you think of prunes, you think of bowels, not bones, but over a decade ago, researchers at Oklahoma State tried giving a dozen prunes a day to a group of postmenopausal women, using a dozen dried apple rings as a control. After 3 months, only the subjects who consumed the prunes had significant elevations in an enzyme marker of bone formation, although prunes didn't seem to affect markers of bone breakdown. So prunes may help more with building bones than preventing bone loss, though the reverse was found with almonds, so maybe a little prune-almond trail mix is in order. While this bump in bone formation indices one might expect with this improvement, one might expect if they did a longer study, we would actually see an impact on bone mineral density. And 9 years later, just such a study was done. 12 months on dried plums versus apples, and both dried fruit regimens appeared to have bone protective effects, though the prunes seemed to work better in the arm bone and spine. So the Dried Plum Marketing Board wants everyone to know that dried plums are the most effective fruit in both preventing and reversing bone loss. But only 2 fruits have ever been tested, plums and apples. But if this does pan out for other plants, a fruit and vegetables approach may provide a very sensible and natural alternative therapy for osteoporosis treatment, one that is likely to have numerous additional health-related benefits. All we have to do is convince people to actually do it. If you put people on a low-salt diet, meaning only getting twice as much sodium as they need, as opposed to a usual salt diet where they're getting 5 times more, you get a significant improvement in artery function. Lower salt, better arterial function, suggesting heart protective effects beyond just blood pressure reduction. Now, this was after dropping people's salt intake by about a teaspoon a day for 2 weeks. What if you only dropped salt intake by like a half teaspoon a day? You still get a significant improvement in artery function, and it happens within just 2 days of reducing one's salt intake, or even after a single meal. A high-salt meal, which is to say just a typical amount of salt consumed in a commonly eaten meal, can significantly suppress artery function within 30 minutes. Here's what happens 30, 60, 90, 120 minutes after a meal with just a pinch of salt in it. Here's what happens after the same meal, but with a 1/4 teaspoon of salt in it. A significant suppression of arterial function. Now, is this in addition to the spike in blood pressure from salt, or because of the spike in blood pressure? If you take people with normal blood pressure and give them a bowl of soup containing how much salt a regular meal might contain, their blood pressure goes up over the next 3 hours compared to the same soup with no added salt. Now, this doesn't happen to everyone. This is just the average response. Some people are resistant to the effects of salt on their blood pressure. So what if you repeated the artery function experiment on them? Unfortunately, the title kind of ruins the suspense and gives it away. As you can see, even in people whose blood pressure is unresponsive to salt intake, they still suffer significant suppression of their artery function. So even independent of any effects on blood pressure, salt hurts our arteries, and that harm begins within minutes of it going into our mouth for our major arteries and even our itty-bitty blood vessels. Using something called laser Doppler flowmetry, you can measure blood flow in tiny vessels in our skin. Here's blood flow at baseline. Now, to get the blood vessels to open up, they warmed up the skin. The reason we may turn pink when we get into a hot bath is that the blood vessels in our skin are opening up. And that's what happens. Big increase in blood flow with the warming, but that's on a low-salt diet. A high-salt diet starts out the same at the beginning, but after the same heating, significantly less blood flow. The arteries just don't seem to open up as well on a high-salt diet, unless you inject vitamin C into their skin. That seems to reverse the salt-induced suppression of blood vessel function. So if an antioxidant reverses the salt effect, then the way salt may be damaging our artery function is through oxidative stress, the formation of free radicals in our bloodstream. But how? Well, there's an enzyme in our body that can detoxify 1 million free radicals a second, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. But compared to a low-salt diet, if we consume a normal salt diet, we suppress the activity of this detoxifying powerhouse of an enzyme. That may help explain why this is your artery function, this is your artery function on salt. With our antioxidant enzymes crippled by the salt, all the excess free radicals may be crippling our arteries, but mop up those extra free radicals by infusing vitamin C into the bloodstream, and artery function returns to normal. Whereas on a low-salt diet, if you drip vitamin C into people's veins, nothing happens, because our antioxidant enzymes are already taking care of business, and haven't been shackled by the sodium of a normal salt diet. Whereas potassium, concentrated in fruits and vegetables, soften the cells that line our arteries and increase the release of nitric oxide that allows our arteries to relax, sodium in our blood stiffens the cells lining our arteries within minutes and reduces nitric oxide release. The more salt, the less nitric oxide is produced. One salty meal, and not only does our blood pressure go up, but our arteries literally stiffen. That's why we could figure out that too much salt was bad for us 4,000 years ago. Maybe we don't need a double-blind trial, maybe we don't need to follow people out for a decade. You may just have to feed someone a bag of potato chips and take their pulse. In 1979, an epidemic of breast enlargement was noted in Italian children. Poultry or veal was suspected, given that estrogens may be fed to farm animals to accelerate their weight gain. After this episode, Europe banned the use of anabolic growth promoters in agriculture, and has banned the importation of American meat from animals injected with drugs like Zeranol, sold as Ralgro Magnum. Zeranol is one of the most potent known endocrine disruptors, 100,000 times more estrogenic than the plastics chemical BPA, for example. And Zeranol constitutes a special case among potential endocrine disruptors because, in contrast to all other estrogenic endocrine-disrupting chemicals, Zeranol is present in human food because it's deliberately used, in fact designed, to be a potent, persistent estrogen, whereas the estrogenic properties of the other chemicals is accidental. And if you drip blood from a cow that's been implanted with the drug on human breast cancer cells in a petri dish, you can double the cancer growth rate. We don't drink blood, though, but preliminary data also showed that muscle extracts, meat extracts, also stimulated breast cancer cell proliferation. Furthermore, Zeranol may cause the transformation of normal breast cells into cancer cells in the first place. Zeranol-containing blood from implanted cattle was capable of transforming normal human breast cells into breast cancer cells within 21 days. Obese women may be at greater risk of developing Zeranol-induced breast cancer, since they already have high levels of leptin, a hormone produced by fat cells that can itself promote breast cancer growth, and Zeranol exposure can greatly enhance this growth-promoting action. This result also suggests that Zeranol may be more harmful to obese breast cancer patients than to normal-weight breast cancer patients in terms of breast cancer development. In conclusion, because these anabolic growth promoters in meat production are by far the most potent hormones found in human food, we should really be testing people, especially children, before and after eating this meat. It amazes me that it hasn't been done. Until it has, we have no idea what kind of threat they may pose, though the fact that Zeranol is as potent as estradiol, the primary sex steroid in women, and DES should concern us. DES is another synthetic estrogen marketed to pregnant women, all pregnant women, until 1971, when it was shown to cause vaginal cancers in the daughters. But few know it was also used in meat. In the absence of effective federal regulation, the meat industry uses hundreds of animal feed additives with little or no concern about the carcinogenic and other toxic effects of dietary residues of these additives. Illustratively, after decades of misleading assurances of the safety of DES and its use as a growth-promoting animal feed additives, the United States finally banned its use some 40 years after it was first shown to be carcinogenic. The meat industry then promptly switched to other potentially carcinogenic additives, such as Zeranol. When girls started dying from vaginal cancer, DES-treated meat was subsequently banned in Europe. However, misleading assurances, including the deliberate suppression of residue data, managed to delay a U.S. ban on DES in the meat supply for 8 years. Today, virtually the entire U.S. population consumes, without any warning, labeling, or information, unknown and unpredictable amounts of hormone residues in meat products over a lifetime. If all hormonal and other carcinogenic feed additives aren't banned immediately, the least we could have is explicit labeling requirements of the use and hormone residue levels in all meat products, including milk and eggs. Why do alcoholic men develop man boobs and other feminine traits? Well, we know estrogens produce feminization, and our liver clears estrogens from the body, and so the original theory was alcohol-induced liver damage leading to the retention of excess estrogens. The problem was that when they measured estrogen levels, they were not elevated, and even in those with cirrhosis of the liver, they appeared to clear estrogens from the body normally. And also men's testicles started shrinking even before serious liver disease developed. So alternative explanations were considered. Well, if it's not due to estrogens produced endogenously, meaning within the body, maybe alcoholics are being exposed to exogenous estrogenic substances from dietary sources, maybe from phytoestrogens in the plants that alcoholic beverages are made from. The discovery that plants could contain hormonal compounds was made back in 1951 by two Australian chemists charged with finding out the cause of an epidemic of infertility in sheep that was ravaging their nation's wool industry. It took them 10 years, but they finally figured out the cause, a compound present in a type of clover called genistein, the same phytoestrogen found in soybeans. Online, you can read about the dreaded clover disease on scaremongering websites, but you'll note they never talk about the difference in dose. To get as much as the sheep were getting from clover, you'd have to drink more than 1,000 cartons of soy milk a day, 8,000 soy burgers, or about 800 pounds of tofu a day. Now, this is not to say you can't overdo it. There are 2 case reports in the medical literature on feminizing effects associated with eating as few as 14 to 20 servings of soy foods a day. But at reasonable doses, or even considerably higher than the 1 or 2 servings a day Asian men eat, soy phytoestrogens do not exert feminizing effects on men. So anyways, back in 1951, we realized plant compounds could be estrogenic. Aha! 2 German researchers realized maybe that's why women who handle hops start menstruating, And indeed, they found estrogenic activity in hops, which is the bittering agent used to make beer. They found trace amounts of the soy phytoestrogens, but in such tiny quantities that beer would not be expected to have an estrogenic effect. But then, in 1999, a potent phytoestrogen called 8-prenylnaringenin was discovered in hops. In fact, the most potent phytoestrogen found to date, 50 times more potent than the genistein in soy, an obvious explanation for the menstrual disturbances in female hop workers in the past. Now that we have machines to pick our hops, our only exposure is likely via beer consumption. But the levels in beer were found to be so low they shouldn't cause any concern. But then in 2001, a study on a hops-containing dietary supplement for quote-unquote breast enhancement raised the concern that another phytoestrogen in hops called isoxanthohumol might be biotransformed by our liver into the more potent 8-PN, which would greatly augment the estrogenic effect of hops. But this was a study done on mice. Thankfully, a study using human estrogen receptors found no such liver transformation, and so all seemed fine until 2005. See, the liver is not the only transformation site inside the human body. The human colon contains trillions of microorganisms with enormous metabolic potential. It's like a whole separate organ within our body, with 100 livers worth of metabolizing power. So let's effectively mix some beer with some poop and see what happens. And indeed, up to a 90% conversion was achieved. Up until then, the concentration of 8-PN in beer was considered too low to affect human health. However, these results show that the activity of the intestinal microbial community could more than tenfold increase the exposure concentration. This can explain why you can detect 8-PN in the urine of beer drinkers for days, because their gut bacteria keep churning it out. Obviously, the amount of straight 8-PN in beer is not the only source of estrogen effects given this conversion. So, a decade ago, the question remained, might drinking too much beer cause estrogenic effects in feminized men? Hops have been used for centuries as a flavoring agent in beer, but over the years a recurring suggestion has been that hops, and therefore beer, may be estrogenic, thanks to a potent phytoestrogen in hops called 8-PN, also known as hopiin. Might beer drinking affect our hormones? Now, even just the alcohol in beer can reduce testosterone levels in men, so when beer was tested as a source of estrogens, the alcohol was first removed. They tested the equivalent of 1 can of beer a day for 1 month on the hormone levels of postmenopausal women, so as not to confound the results with endogenous estrogens, and they found significant alterations of hormonal levels during the beer month, and then coming back to baseline a week afterwards. But does this have any clinical effects, either good or bad? A cross-sectional study of about 1,700 women found that beer drinkers appeared to have better bone density, perhaps because of the pro-estrogenic effects. They don't recommend women start drinking beer for bone health, but suggest it may have beneficial bone effects for women who already drink. What about helping with hot flashes? About half of postmenopausal and perimenopausal women in the U.S. suffer from hot flashes, whereas the prevalence in Japan may be 10 times lower, presumed to be because of their soy consumption. What about hops? There have been a few studies like this and this showing potential benefit, leading to this 2013 review suggesting that hop extracts may be somewhat effective in treating menopausal discomforts. But that was before this study, which reported extraordinary results with about a half teaspoon of dried hops flowers. For example, hot flashes on the bottom, and the placebo group on the right there, the women started out having about 23 hot flashes a week, and throughout the 3-month study continued to have 23 hot flashes a week. In the hops group, they started out even worse, but then down to 19 at the end of the first month, then 9, then just once a week, basically, and similar findings were reported for all the other menopausal symptoms measured. But hey, animal estrogens work too. Millions of women used to be on horse hormones, Premarin from pregnant mare urine. That took care of hot flashes too, and curtailed osteoporosis, but caused a pesky little side effect called breast cancer. Thankfully, when this was realized and millions of women stopped taking it, breast cancer rates fell in countries around the world. This is data from California. The question then is, are the estrogens in hops more like the breast cancer-promoting horse estrogens, or the breast cancer-preventing soy estrogens? The key to understanding the health protective potential of soy phytoestrogens is understanding the difference between the two types of estrogen receptors. There's alpha receptors and beta receptors. Unlike animal estrogen, the soy phytoestrogens bind preferentially to the beta receptors, and in breast tissue they're like yin and yang, with the alpha receptors signaling breast cell proliferation, explaining why horse hormones increase breast cancer risk, whereas the beta receptors, where the soy binds, opposes that proliferative impact. So does the hops phytoestrogens prefer beta too? No. 8-PM is a selective estrogen receptor alpha promoter. Surprisingly, in clear contrast to the soy, 8-PN is a much weaker binder of beta than of alpha. So that explains why hops is such a common ingredient in so-called breast-enhancing supplements, because it acts more like estrogen. Given the breast cancer concerns, use of such products should be discouraged. But just drinking beer could provide the exposure to the hops estrogen as is found in these kinds of products, which could help explain why beer may be more carcinogenic to the breast than some other forms of alcohol. Hispanics living in the United States tend to have less education, a higher poverty rate, and worse access to health care. They represent like the ultimate paradigm of healthcare disparities: the highest rate of uninsured, the lowest rates of health screening and counseling, and the poorest levels of blood pressure and blood sugar control, and other measures of deficient quality of care. So, wow, Hispanics living in the U.S. must just have dismal public health statistics, right? Well, according to the latest national data, the life expectancy of white men and women was 76 and 81. The lives of black men and women cut short by years. How do Hispanics do? Amazingly, they beat out everyone. Hispanics live the longest. This has been called the Hispanic paradox. Hispanics have 24% lower risk of premature death, and lower risks of 9 out of the leading 15 causes of death, notably less cancer and heart disease. This was first noticed 30 years ago, but understandably met with great criticism. Maybe the data was unreliable. No, that did not seem to be it. Maybe only the healthiest people migrate? Turns out the opposite may be true. Then there's always the salmon bias theory, proposing that maybe Latinos return to their home country to die, and so aren't counted in our death statistics. But that theory didn't pan out either. Systematic reviews confirm the existence of this Hispanic paradox. And so, given the strong evidence, it might be time to accept it and move on to figuring out, well, wait a second, why do they live so long? Figure out the cause. The very existence of the Hispanic paradox could represent a major opportunity to identify a protective factor for cardiovascular disease applicable to the rest of the population. After all, whatever's going on is strong enough to overcome the disadvantaging effects of poverty, language barriers, low levels of education, health literacy, quality of healthcare, and insurance coverage. Before we get our hopes up too much, though, maybe it's just genetic? No, because as foreign-born Hispanics acculturate to the United States, as they embrace the American way of life, their mortality rates go up. So, what positive health behaviors may account for Hispanic longevity? Maybe they exercise more? No, Hispanics appear to be even more sedentary. Hispanics do smoke less, however the paradox persists even after taking that into account. Maybe it's their diet. As they acculturate, they start eating more processed foods and animal foods, and fewer plant foods. And perhaps one plant food in particular, beans. Maybe a reason Hispanics live longer is because they eat more beans. Although Hispanics only represent about 10% of the population, they eat a third of the beans in the United States, individually eating 4 to 5 times more beans per capita, a few pounds a month, as opposed to a few pounds a year. And that may help explain the Hispanic paradox, because legumes, beans, split peas, chickpeas, lentils, cool down systemic inflammation. This is the mechanism they propose in terms of lung health. While cigarette smoking and air pollution cause lung inflammation, which increases the risk of emphysema and lung cancer, when we eat beans, the good bacteria in our gut take the fiber and resistant starch and form small-chain fatty acids that are absorbed back into our system and decrease systemic inflammation, which not only inhibits lung cancer development, but also other cancers throughout the body. Here's the lung data with Hispanics in red having the lowest rates of COPD and lung cancer, and also tending to have lower rates of bladder cancer, throat cancer, colorectal cancer for both men and women. This whole systemic inflammation concept is also supported by the fact that when Hispanics do get lung cancer, or colon cancer, or breast cancer, they have improved survival rates, and maybe same with heart attack and stroke survival. Decreasing whole-body inflammation may be important for both prevention and survival. Now, Asian Americans, here in green, appear to have some protection too, which may be because they eat more beans too, in the form of tofu and other soy foods, as soy intake is associated with both lung cancer prevention and lung cancer survival. Now, Hispanics also eat more corn, tomatoes, and chili peppers. A quarter of the diet in Mexico is made up of corn tortillas, and Mexican-Americans born in Mexico and Mexican-Americans born in the U.S. continue to eat more than the general population. Looking at cancer rates around the world, not only was bean consumption associated with less colon, breast, and prostate cancer, but also rice and corn consumption appeared protectively correlated as well. Of course, since NAFTA, the Mexican diet has changed to incorporate more soda, processed, and animal foods, and their obesity rates are fast catching up to ours. In the U.S., Hispanics eat more fruits and vegetables than other groups, about 6 or 7 servings a day. Still don't even make the recommended minimum of 9 servings, though, so their diet could stand some improvement. So yes, Hispanics may only have half the odds of dying from heart disease, but it's still the #1 cause of death among Hispanics. Therefore, the current results should not be misinterpreted to mean that cardiovascular disease is rare among Hispanics, so ideally they'd be eating even more whole plant foods. But one thing everyone can learn from the Hispanic experience is that along with a shift towards a more plant-based diet in general, beans may be potent tools in the prevention and treatment of chronic disease. There are 3 broad theories about evolution and food. One is that humans have become adapted to the products of the agricultural revolution over the last 10,000 years. 2 is the paleo view, that 10,000 years, that's a blink of an evolutionary eye, and that humans have adapted to Paleolithic diets with lots of lean meat. But why stop there? The last 200,000 years as mostly Stone Age humans represents just the last 1% of 20 or so million years we've been evolving since our common great ape ancestor. During our truly formative years, the first 90% of our existence, one might say, our nutritional requirements reflect an ancestral past in which we ate mostly leaves, flowers, and fruits, with some bugs thrown in thanks to wormy apples to get our vitamin B12. For this reason, another approach that might improve our understanding of the best dietary practices for modern humans is to focus attention not on the past, but rather on the here and now, that is, on the study of the foods eaten by our closest living relatives. Given the bulk of our ancestral diets, and the lack of evidence supporting any notable diet-related changes in human nutrient requirements, metabolism, or physiology compared to our fellow great apes. This could explain why fruits and vegetables are not only just so good for us, but vital to our survival. We're actually one of the few species so adapted to a plant-based diet that we could actually die from not eating fruits and vegetables. from the vitamin C deficiency disease scurvy. Most other animals just make their own vitamin C. But why would our body waste all that effort making vitamin C when we evolved hanging out in the trees just eating fruits and veggies all day long? It's presumably not a coincidence that the few other mammals unable to synthesize their own vitamin C, like guinea pigs and bunny rabbits and fruit bats, are all, like us great apes, strongly herbivorous. Even during the Stone Age, we may have been getting up to 10 times more vitamin C than we get today, and 10 times more dietary fiber, based on essentially rehydrated human fossilized feces. The question is, are these incredibly high nutrient intakes simply an unavoidable byproduct of eating whole plant foods all the time, or might they actually be serving some important function, like antioxidant defense? Plants create antioxidants to defend their own structures against free radicals. The human body must defend itself against the same types of pro-oxidants, and so we have also evolved an array of amazing antioxidant enzymes, which is effective but not infallible. Free radicals can breach our defenses, cause damage that accumulates with age, leading to a variety of disease-causing and ultimately fatal changes. That's where plants may come in. Plant-based, antioxidant-rich foods traditionally formed a major part of our diet, and so we didn't have to evolve that great of an antioxidant system. We could just let the plants in our diet pull some of the weight, like the not bothering to make vitamin C thing. Let the fruit do it. Using plants as a crutch may well have relieved the pressure for further evolutionary development of our own defenses, meaning we become dependent on getting lots of plant foods in our diet, and when we don't, we may suffer adverse health consequences. Even during the Stone Age, this may not have been a problem. Only in recent history did we start giving up on whole plant foods. Even modern-day paleo and low-carb advocates may be eating more vegetables than those on standard Western diets. There's this perception that low-carbers are chowing down on the 3 Bs, beef, butter, and bacon, but that's just a small minority. What they are eating more of is salad. The #1 thing an internet low-carb community said they were eating more of was vegetables. Great! If people want to cut their carb intake by swapping junk food for vegetables, that's not the problem. The concern is the shift to animal-sourced foods. Greater adherence to a low-carb diet high in animal sources of fat and protein was associated with higher mortality, for example after a heart attack, meaning they cut their lives short. If there's one takeaway from our studies of ancestral diets, perhaps it's that diets based largely on plant foods promote health and longevity.